When you think about it, we all have some connection to sea. My sea story and my connection is really interesting because I had no idea that I really had that connection for most of my life. But it was only when I was here and I started thinking, did it become obvious that I had a sea connection and obvious that it played a role within my life? Not necessarily something I thought about. I'm Peter Armstrong. I'm the President and CEO of Mystic Seaport Museum, and this is my sea story. Well, it's pretty clear to everybody that I'm not from America. So I arrived here about 11 years ago. I've specialized in working with museums that had living history and education programs, and when the position came up here as the chief executive and the president, this kind of fitted the perfect scenario for me. I was excited about applying for it and was really taken aback about how an important museum it is, because I'd heard about this museum on the other side of the pond. The Mystic Seaport Museum is well known as one of the leading maritime museums in the world. Well, I was born in a place called Whitley Bay, which is a seaside resort on the northeast coast of England. So it's a beautiful place with incredible beaches and an amazing lighthouse, but of course you don't want to go in the sea because it's -3 degrees. And so it's a nice place to be, but it's not really a seaside resort unless the sun comes out, and being in the northeast of England, that happens twice a year. It's on the edge of the Tyne, which is a river up in the northeast of England where shipbuilding and coal mining and fishing was huge. When I was a young boy and lived on a seaside resort, most of the time you were down where the beach was. So there was amusement arcades and there was, trams and all the things that you have on a normal British seaside resort, ice creams and fish and chips. So you spent a lot of time down there as a kid, that was your escape to get down and just, run around on the beach. It really had an influence on us because many people that lived in Whitley Bay worked within the shipbuilding industry. So there was always a connection to ships and shipbuilding. When I was appointed as a president and I was coming along here and I was meeting everybody that's got a maritime connection, I was thinking, what's my maritime connection? How am I connected to the sea? Okay, I was born and brought up there, but many people are. What's the difference there? And that's when I kind of started to think about how the sea and the maritime experience had affected my father and how that had been an influence to him and consequently an influence to myself. My father joined the British Merchant Navy at the age of 16 and he left at the age of 22. So he was only in the Merchant Navy for 6 years. But throughout his life, the influence of the sea and those 6 years came back and back and back again. I do know that when he passed, my mother sent me some information about the things that he had in his collections, and one of the interesting things was a book of all the ships that he'd sailed on. And although, he was a kind of deckhand and occasionally he worked in the catering department, he wasn't a captain or a chief seaman, he certainly loved his time at the sea. And so when I looked at that book and I realized that attached to that were writing that was done on a computer, I realized he must have done that very much later on in his life because computers were just coming in as he was in his 60s and 70s. The document's kind of just the regular documents that the normal guy that went in the Merchant Navy would have, and probably that makes them more precious than others because, it's all very well if you're a captain, you keep all the photographs and you have all the things, but if you're just a regular guy that goes to sea, it's interesting just to see those regular documents. He tells about the fact that he painted the main mast, but he painted from the bottom to the top, and when he got to the top he realized he had to slide down back to the paint. So there's a great photograph of him covered in paint for that. I know the stories when he crossed the line, which meant that they went across the equator. The ship would have dressed somebody up to look like Neptune, and he would have got covered in water and he would have been covered in foam, and they would have blessed him for being somebody who was across the line. All these kind of activities took place. It was all memories that he had as a young man that he was establishing. At the time, you don't really think about what impressions you have on them. You're just your dad telling tales, right? And telling stories and things. But when you look back and you kind of try to connect it to where the sea has had an influence on someone, it really becomes very poignant that he obviously had a massive connection to the sea, even though he only spent 6 years in the Merchant Navy. The sea was his love. When we were kids, because we lived by the sea, we would go on the kind of dad's adventures. And dad's adventures would consist of us going on a bus to St. Mary's Lighthouse and then walking to a place called Tynemouth Priory. And we would just do activities connected to the water. Sometimes we'd do sandcastles, sometimes we'd go into the caves that you weren't allowed to go into, sometimes we'd just like play along the cliffs. So we just would have an adventure that would take us all day on a Sunday from one side of Whitley Bay to Tynemouth, which is the next town along. One of the things that connected my father and I with the sea was fishing. So we never caught anything, and we're never really that serious of it. But my father had a sea fishing rod, so one of these big, huge things, and he would take me with a hand line, which is basically just a line attached to some wood with a hook on the end, and off he would go and fish into the ocean, and I would then walk along the rocks trying to fish into all the pools. You know, probably the sort of thing now they would say was completely wrong, of having your 5-year-old son wander off along the rocks by the edge of the sea, but in those days it was great. As I got older, my father became less able, and we still lived by the sea in Whitley Bay, and I could drive. I would drive to a place called the Battery, which was on the end of the River Tyne, and we'd sit in the Battery and he would have his binoculars and we'd look out at the ships just staring out at the sea for a while, and then the ice cream would be bought, then the fish and chips would be bought, and we would just enjoy looking at the boats coming in. Everybody has a sea story. One of the great things about the museum is the ability to capture those stories and tell others. And once you open that door, there's so much more you can learn. I just want people to kind of think that they'll have a sea story somewhere, as will everybody else. So we all have very different lives with different thoughts and different attitudes. But at the end of the day, we're all really connected. And the sea is one of those things that, you know, no matter what, you have a connection to it. So you have a connection to another individual who also has their connection. So it's a bit like being out there when we had COVID and we realized that nature was a really important thing to us. And I think a sea story helps us do that as well.